What's going on, everyone? It's Justin here, joined by my co-host Brandon, and we're back on the featured podcast, and today we are going to talk about podcasting. So personally, I'm quite new to the podcast space. I didn't really listen to them before. I just always wanted to make one, have like another platform to talk about topics. But obviously, recently, Joe Rogan signed a massive deal with Spotify that Brandon and I have kind of discussed. I think when I texted you, like, Joe Rogan just signed exclusive.
Yeah, you're in the numbers of 40, 50 million.
Yeah, Brandon was saying 50 million. I thought it was like 20, 30, just based on the Ninja deal. Then the number of 100 started getting thrown around. And then all of a sudden, I see this tweet and a retweet of a story that points to the fact that it could actually be 300 million or even above that. And it actually makes total sense. So first off, why don't you talk about like Joe Rogan, his significance in the industry and what he does and just what makes his content so special and just the amount of power he has in the podcast space.
Yeah, he's been doing it a long time. That was the thing. He started it as a joke back when he was doing the UFC interviews. Yeah. And from there, he interviewed his comedy friends. And then it was his openness and the long form podcast that really drew people to it. And then the quality of guests he started to get on through the network he had achieved through being in the UFC. And he is looked at as someone as like the Michael Jordan of podcasting. And this deal is significant and has shown to be significant as Spotify's numbers jumped right away after the deal was announced.
The equities itself was an indication of how big this was going to be and how good of a value that, because whenever there's an exclusive deal signed, and even in any category, there's always a bit of skepticism as to whether or not it was worth it, or if they overpaid, if they got it at the right time. And I feel like this is, would you say this is one of the first like large exclusive, well, there was a Howard Stern show, but since then, is this like the first major deal within the space that could essentially kind of have an effect throughout the industry? And
well, I think there's been smaller ones already, like Call Her Daddy is number 2, and that went to Barstool Sports, right? Yeah. Like it's this one. Joe Rogan is in another class. Like his podcast is downloaded more than CNN, and for this deal, I think it's going to be the biggest. I can't see another deal eclipsing it. So it was cool to talk with Mike about how big this deal potentially was.
Yeah, for sure. And even like looking at the gaming space and like YouTube channels that are being bought out exclusively now, I think like in this type of content industry, it's always a fight for market share. You want people on your streaming platforms. You want people to be within your ecosystem, whether it's Apple, it's Amazon, and Spotify, how they've already done amazingly on music, being the universal platform on both iOS and Android, now trying to increase that leverage in the podcast space by integrating some video. And yeah, it's using all these resources, and how like Netflix has become a big maker of original content, whereas before they were just a distributor in the first phase of their business. So we're going to jump now to the guest, Michael, who is the co-founder of Blockworks Group, and Blockworks also manages quite a few podcasts as well. So let's get his insight on this topic. So first off, thank you so much for joining us today. I was scrolling through Twitter on the day that the Rogan deal was announced, and a lot of people had shared your insight as to how the deal could be worth more than the alleged $100 million. And, you know, like a lot of times when the news comes out and a number is thrown around, the headlines all say that, and people just look at it and don't really read much into it. Like, that's a lot of money. But there's more behind it. And as someone in the podcast industry like yourself, I think you broke it down very well, and both in the article and the tweet. So today we just wanted to hear more about that and also the insights of the podcast industry. But first, I wanted to let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate you bringing me on the show and the kind words. I'm glad I fooled you with my knowledge on Twitter. So I'm Mike Ippolito. I'm a co-founder of Blockworks Group. So we're an events and media company. We kind of sit at the intersection between traditional finance and all things blockchain, crypto, digital assets. We've been doing work in the podcast space for like 2.5 years now. We're sort of a business front end for a whole bunch of different shows. And it's been really interesting just learning about the industry and kind of how these things work. And hopefully some of that came across in the Rogan piece I wrote.
Yeah, it did. Everything about the article that we saw online was it was something new and fresh. People were just speculating on the 100 million. Then you went and made the projection that it was upwards in the 300 million. So Justin, I think you were preparing from the YouTube space of spending 10 years in there. Like, what did you see specific about the art that applied to you?
Yeah, so I'm pretty new to the podcast space. I've always been on like the YouTube side, and in there's like a couple of exclusive deals on much smaller scales, brand deals, and I think Yeah, the Rogan deal definitely stuck out because people who were in the podcast space were like, "This is big. This could change the way the industry kind of moves forward." And with like video being such a big part of media and Spotify even experimenting with video medium, um, yeah, it was. I would like to have you kind of talk about like why you believe the deal could be worth over $100 million.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost, I don't have any insider information, but I would,
Yeah,
I bet quite a bit that it's more than just 100 million. So, I mean, leaving podcasting aside for a second, if you just look at comps, right, like, and the acquisitions that Spotify has made in the past 2 years or something like that, if you look at things like The Ringer, so Bill
yeah,
Simmons' show, if you look at Gimlet Media, I mean, those were private companies, so their revenue wasn't public, but the consensus looks like they got about a 10x multiple on their revenue. Same thing with Joe Rogan. It was speculated or kind of reported in articles like Forbes that he was doing about $30 million a year. So just from a pure comps perspective, you'd look at, all right, he's doing 30 million. Recent acquisitions got about a 10x multiple. Joe Rogan, there's a little bit more kind of sex appeal to an acquisition like that, even than those previous purchases. So I would guess at least he would get that sort of multiple. And you can even go back and look at guys like Howard Stern as well, who, he back in, I don't know, like 2005 or something like that, he signed a $500 million deal. So initially when I was looking at that $100 million price tag, I was like, that just seems small. And purely from if I'm Joe Rogan as well, I think, look, he does $30 million a year in revenue. He's got like 4 full-time employees. So basically, and what are the costs of doing his job, right? It's literally like him and a microphone. So basically, he's looking at like a $27 million a year annuity. And if I had a $27 million a year annuity, I definitely wouldn't sell it for $100 million. That just doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think those were kind of the factors that made me think the deal was probably worth at least 300 million, probably more, honestly.
and even on like the CPM basis alone, I think you broke it down both in terms of the equity gains off Spotify, the subscription base, and also the CPM. Which, from someone from YouTube, especially in the tech industry, our CPMs are not exactly high. It's a very brand deal weighted industry. So the CPMs alone, like looking at the number, whether it's the 25 or the $15, is higher than I'm used to seeing. And you mentioned just off the amount of downloads, which I believe is around 200 million a month. That alone explains that the deal could be much higher than that.
Totally. I think actually something, so the interesting thing about the Spotify thing, I think one of the big aspects of this deal as well is deep platforming, or Rogan's fear about deep platforming. So, I mean, he had this massive audience, right, on one of the biggest platforms in the world, which is YouTube. They've got something like 2 billion users or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think the calculus that, Joe Rogan was performing is like, look, I've got this massive following on YouTube. The problem is I could lose that at any moment, right, if I were to get deplatformed. And he's complained about that, in previous shows. So he's moving to Spotify, right, which on the one hand has got about 1/10 of the subscribers. They've got like 286 million. So that's great. There's opportunity cost, right, of him moving to a platform that has so many fewer subscribers. But the risk that he's offboarding is that fear of getting deplatformed, and he's kind of locking in a profit for himself. The other interesting thing about Spotify is, one of the big problems with podcast advertising in general is that, they haven't been able to get programmatic to work. It's really hard to get audience specific information on people who are listening to your show. And Spotify's been pretty vocal about trying to bring programmatic advertising to podcasting. So the interesting thing about the Rogan acquisition is that they're essentially licensing out his massive library of shows, right?
Yeah.
So the interesting thing about that is Rogan's got such a big audience that he talks to, right? Like if Spotify, depending on, whatever sort of algorithm or data they have on their users, they could actually get more specific about, okay, maybe the main, they could kind of get more specific about the demographics that Rogan attracts and serve more targeted ads, which would actually allow you to jack that CPM up above 15 or 25. So there's probably some value unlock in just the technology and everything that Spotify brings.
And he wasn't on Spotify previously, right? He held off on Spotify, and Spotify has both the subscription model as well as the free version that plays ads. So for them, either way, it does make a lot of sense in terms of how the deal works. And on the equity side of things, do you predict that much of the deal could have been on the equity aspect as well, along with cash?
I don't know. I certainly hope so, because if he didn't get any equity, he's getting hosed there. And he has taken equity in some of the advertisements or products that he's promoted on the show before. So it wouldn't be totally out of character. And I think, if he looked at, after the 2 days after that deal got announced and he didn't get any equity, then he'd be not a super happy camper.
Yeah. And you were saying that Spotify was the clear winner here. How could Rogan have better leveraged this deal to get more out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I said that, and I tried to caveat it with based on public information, right? Yeah. So if we're going off that $100 million number, again, privately, I think the probably value is much higher. I don't know if he got equity, and I think the other big question mark in this deal is how long is the licensing agreement going for?
He said a few years kind of thing, but nothing too detailed.
3 years, yeah. So yeah, I mean. Overall, the reason I think it's more of a win for Spotify is one, just look at, the shareholder value that it's driven over a short period of time. It's rare that you see the market react to something like that. And then two, just in terms of their overall aspirations, right, for making podcasting, more advertisable, right? I think that the library that he's going to bring, to their programmatic advertising program is just going to be super valuable. So I think overall, that's why it's more valuable for them. That being said, cashing out at 100 or 300 million, it's hard to feel too bad for the guy too. So definitely, he's getting paid too.
And do you think like the network wars have begun? Like once YouTube, I think you mentioned that YouTube is the loser in a deal like this, losing one of the biggest players in the podcast industry, and with like the whole like ranking of how like YouTube's become a big player and where people consume podcasts. Like personally, I watch a lot of like the highlight channels, H3 and stuff. Do you think YouTube will have to make a move, or usually it's a case of the primary platform being the place where they grow and they end up going to another or new platform that is hosted by a large company? The Ninja deal, for example, in the gaming space, how Microsoft and their new streaming platform bought them exclusively for, I believe, 20 to 30 million. Do you see this being like a trigger of more deals like this to come?
Yeah, I won't pretend to be a massive expert in this, but I do think we're starting to see the beginning of some pretty interesting battles, right? I mean, one conflict here is just two different business models. So on Spotify, they're obviously going for the subscription business model, and YouTube is, their entire platform is built around advertising. I do think one thing about that's interesting about YouTube and some of the earlier platforms is, if you think about this, Spotify just paid anywhere from $100 to $300 million for Joe Rogan, but YouTube basically got him for free in the beginning, right? So
that's true.
I guess it kind of depends here. It's a win for Spotify, but if you think about it, the model here seems to be for some of these newer platforms to just shell out money for the content creators that the original platforms like YouTube got for free. So actually, I guess there probably is a third winner here, which is just that if you're a good content creator, then just like Netflix kind of drove up the price for premium producers of content in the movie industry and the TV industry, the same thing is probably going to happen for content creators from YouTube and podcasts and stuff like that have huge audiences that these platforms, as they start competing for eyeballs, they're going to have to pay up for. So I think actually the content creators really come out on top here as well.
For sure. Yeah, I think another example that came out after the Joe Rogan deal was the Some Good News channel, and how 14 episodes in, a project that was started at around the beginning of COVID was apparently a bidding war that CBS ended up getting for their streaming platform. And we're seeing a lot of large companies with plenty of resources and capital move towards like the streaming and building the recurring revenue streams, such as Apple and their original content investment into their show, Disney as well. So I think, that's a good example of how the exclusive deals are coming along. And Joe Rogan, that like within a week, I think it was crazy to see two things like that. I don't think people expected the YouTube show to sell. As someone who is in the podcast space, how important do you think the video medium is to the podcast?
That's a great question. I've kind of got two minds of this. I think one, what makes podcasting so interesting actually just is the audio. And I would listen to Daniel Ek, the founder of Spotify. He went on a podcast, Invest Like the Best, talking about this about 2.5 months ago. There's just something very interesting and kind of intimate about audio as a medium. When you don't have the visual aspect, it just feels like you're a fly on the wall and you're in the room and kind of sitting in and listening in on this intimate conversation, which is just so cool. But on the other hand, you look at platforms like YouTube, and you kind of need video there, and they're where the audience is right now. So I think from an almost like a more artistic kind of standpoint, I do think there's something unique and cool about just audio. But I do think if you're a creator right now, you just got to be thinking about video, and you got to be thinking about putting your stuff on YouTube, because that's just where the audiences are. So
for sure. Yeah. In our case, we kind of reverse engineered it, because I came from the YouTube space. I think we've made about 1,000 videos over the last decade. So I've been doing it since like I was 12 or 13. And so the podcast space was almost like reverse engineered. We started with the video and used all the equipment that was already had, and then the audio, like a few technical things in the first few episodes. But yeah, I do understand that like the whole audio part of it is it's a different experience than video. Like in YouTube, you almost feel like you have to have your video within a certain amount of time, and it's all about like watch time and retention and trying to figure out the medium between that. But I find the podcast is like a much more authentic experience that you can listen to throughout the day. Another interesting thing was how like Spotify is actually experimenting with video, and how like they have been introducing a few podcasts that were very much on YouTube and run by YouTubers, Zane and Heath's Unfiltered podcast, and how they are going to be the initial testers of the video medium on Spotify. Do you think that's going to be something that Spotify is going to follow through with and make it a big part of it to try to bring over some of the market share from the YouTube side? Or is it more of just like a short period test that ends up going back to like the audio experience that they're known for?
I think your guess is as good as mine here. I think there is a lot of value to to video as a medium, and I think the Rogan investment is just so perfect because the guy's kind of synonymous with podcasting. He was the first big one to do it, right? So aside from the finances and whatever of the deal, I think it was just a symbolic victory as much as anything else for Spotify. But I do think it's clear that they're investing in video. Those guys are smarter than me, so if they say there's something to it, then there probably is. And I think the success of YouTube, right, just proves that there's definitely a lot of value to the medium. So I think we'll see. And I think Spotify clearly isn't done making any acquisitions. They have a lot of access to cheap capital, and they've proven that they're willing to deploy it. So I think we'll look. I mean, one of the things that I would be looking back for in a year is what other acquisitions did Spotify make, and if we see more acquisitions on the video side of things, then I think that tells us a lot.
Yeah, and Spotify is very focused on artists, so I think going to video and having the music videos uploaded there rather than YouTube is a good move for them as well. What's someone starting out as a podcast, what are some tips that you normally give as someone that has 25 working on the front end with you?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of dirty secret about podcasting, right, is that people kind of monkey with the format and do a whole bunch of different stuff. But at the end of the day, the thing that drives growth, especially if you have an interview-based format, is just get kind of the biggest, most impressive people that you can on the show, because ultimately your job as a moderator, right, is to bring out the interesting things that they have to say. So, and you also get to plug into their networks when you're sharing the episode. So I would say just focus on getting really interesting, well-known people and let the content kind of drive itself. And then I would also say in the beginning, try to understand exactly who you're speaking to. Like starting a podcast or a video channel or anything like else is just like starting a company. Like what can you do that no one else can? It could be experience, it could be a network or a Rolodex that you could call on, but really have a good understanding of who you're talking to and the content, like the audience that you're creating content for, and then everything kind of grows from there.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Michael, for your time today.
So that was like a really good conversation with Michael. He gave like just like the raw opinions of it. And I know he has a lot of industry knowledge in like the markets, being in New York, you're like in the central hub of North American business. So being two kids from the island, we obviously follow the stuff that is online, but a lot of times you see like these news articles and these blogs, and the way they kind of take one headline and run with it is hard to figure out like what the magnitude of the deal really is. And I think after Michael broke it down, it makes sense that this like 100
seems like more.
Yeah, like 100 million, even though it's a lot of money in the media industry, it almost seems like a bad deal for Joe Rogan by the time you look at the numbers, because he could have taken that number elsewhere and tried to see if another big network that likely has $100 million is willing to take his thing. And he's at that point of his career where, the leverage is essentially unlimited. But obviously associating with a brand like Spotify and them forking up the funds makes a lot of sense. And I think it's just like when you break these stories down and learn more about them and bring people in who are very knowledgeable, that's what makes it also interesting and why we kind of wanted to start this podcast in the first place. So that's like our first episode of like our bonus series where we explore some of the current events, the news and business and technology, the latest and greatest. But I hope you guys enjoyed that, and we'll talk to you guys in the next one.
See ya.